Two questions. Definition of war crimes, is that a universally agreed definition?
There's the most universally accepted definition at the moment comes from the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which sets out war crimes offences, and there's also details sort of specifying the exact provisions of that. And Australia's incorporated that almost wholeheartedly into its, copy and pasted into its own legislation. So
it's become a very generic term used without many people understanding what it means, I being one of them. But I just think some publicity of that the definition would help. And the second question, the criminal court in The Hague, what countries are members of it?
The International Criminal Court. I'll start with that question. There's about 108 members last time I checked of the. There are some significant absences, and quite a few of them are permanent members of the UN Security Council. I think, with the exception of the UK and France, no permanent member is a member of the court as well. So that's obviously Russia, China, and the United States. But recently there was a very significant accession from Japan, which joined just before I left The Hague, actually, and that was the world's second largest economy. Is a significant new member, and there's 108 states parties. So the process towards universality is well underway, I think, there. In terms of war crimes, the definition of war crimes and the definition of crimes against humanity, the definition of genocide, there's very specific provisions of whether they take place in an armed conflict. There's slight variations when you incorporate them into domestic law. So I'd really have to get down into the nitty-gritty there, I think it was. But the best source for that is the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which sets out exactly what is a war crime and exactly what conditions it has to take place under.
Thank you. Mark Avery, member of the public. Are there any circumstances that you could possibly think of that might justify Australia knowingly allowing a war criminal to come to Australia?
Well, I mean, if for example, an Australian citizen committed war crimes overseas, then there was no other country they could be returned to, then they would presumably have to come back to Australia, and then it would be Australia would be under the obligation to take action against the allegations of war crimes offences. So that would be a circumstance where I'd imagine that could happen.
Can I just go back to the definition of war crimes? Obviously, they can take place in the context of an international conflict. What about, for example, an internal conflict? Kosovo might be an example where you've got a region of a state which wants to separate, for example. And what about a purely internal conflict, more in the nature of a police action, perhaps the events in Argentina and Chile in the 1970s, for example, would be examples of that kind of conduct. Do all or any of those currently come within the definition?
Well, the real gap in the Australian legislation is about war crimes committed in non-international armed conflict prior to 2002, which is an obvious gap. So after that, then I think the answer to your question would be yes, it is covered. But before that, I think there would be there's question marks. The Geneva Conventions has a common Article 3 which talks about internal armed conflict, and we ratified that convention in 1957. There is a Geneva Conventions Act 1957. But there's a big question mark about whether that loose reference to internal armed conflict actually sort of translates into covering those issues in the Australian context, and I would suspect it doesn't. So that would, and yeah, in terms of you mentioned the Argentina or issues like that, we have signed the Torture Act, for example. So depending on the time frame you're looking at, that would be one area where there'd be scope for seeking prosecutions in that area.
Could you hazard a guess as to how many war criminals are in Australia and where?
All the media keeps asking me this question. I think it's really impossible to say until you give a domestic law enforcement agency the resources to look into the allegations. If you look at the only previous example we've had in Australia, the Special Investigations Unit that was established in 1987, they conducted over 800 investigations in Australia, 841 I think it was, and so I think you could speculate that they're going to be the allegations they would look into. I think would at least be in the order of hundreds, but as to how many suspects are actually here or genuine cases they might have, it's impossible to say. I think, but I think the other issue I raised here in the paper is the comparison with Canada, where you have very strong border screening processes in place. It's obviously not a perfect comparison with Australia because the reasons I outlined, but it does suggest that when you do dedicate resources to this issue, that people are prepared to come forward and allegations do arise, and quite a substantial number in Canada's case.
Simon Gentry, does the ICC initiate investigations and searches, or do they have to have all cases referred to them?
Both situations can arise. In the case of the investigation in Darfur, that was referred by the UN Security Council because Sudan wasn't a member of the International Criminal Court, but under its statute there's provision for the Security Council to refer cases for investigation. So that was a case of a referral. In all the other instances, it's investigated in Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic. Those cases have all been actually requested by the governments themselves. They've come to the court and asked the prosecutor to conduct investigations. So, but there is also provision for the prosecutor to initiate investigations in member states on his own accord. So, but that, to my knowledge, hasn't yet occurred.
Ben Grace is my name. I was just wondering, in what circumstances Australia could defer to the ICCC, the International Criminal Court, to prosecute war crimes, those accused of war crimes found in Australia?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, there's a principle of complementarity whereby states accept an obligation to either prosecute alleged suspects in their own national courts or to extradite them to the International Criminal Court if it's seeking to prosecute them. So there's this new it's a new rule in international law that you either take responsibility for the suspects yourself or you transfer them to the International Criminal Court, which has sort of increased the responsibility of countries like Australia to establish domestic war crimes units. So it's in the position to take that action if it needs to. Politically, I think it would be very awkward to surrender an Australian citizen or somebody living in Australia to the International Criminal Court to face war crimes charges. I think it'd be much more, the government would much more prefer to run those cases internally in its own national courts, because the provisions of the Rome Statute tend to sort of give the impression that you're willing or unable to conduct your own investigation. So you'd have to be unwilling and unable or unable to do so before you would surrender, which would be a bit of a concession to make.
Toby Collis, a quick question. If Australia is to, if your proposals are going to go ahead and enact some more comprehensive legislation, what do you say about the problem that might arise in the enacting of retrospective legislation for war crimes, and in particular the crime of genocide, considering there have been issues as to Australia's treatment of Indigenous population as to whether that constitutes genocide? If that's the case, do you think the suggestion as to more comprehensive legislation is going to be unlikely?
Thank you, Toby, former intern. I'm not sure the retrospective legislation is such a big problem in every it might be a problem in some circumstances, but I don't think it's a problem in every circumstance. The War Crimes Unit that was set up in the late 80s, early 90s operated under retrospective legislation. Australia had to amend the War Crimes Act to allow those prosecutions to take place. And there was a case, the Polyukovic case, which discussed this issue of retrospective legislation, and that, as far as Australian law is concerned, is still the guide towards retrospective legislation. And in some instances, there's a clear rationale why Australia could make retrospective legislation. In the case of genocide, for example, Australia ratified the treaty very early on in the 50s, but didn't actually implement it in Australian law until 2002. So, and a court subsequently found there was no provisions under domestic law to convict anyone for genocide. So, you could plausibly make the case, I think, that because we had ratified the convention so early on, that there was a case that there was an expectation that genocide could be considered illegal under Australian law since that period, at least. And there's other similar examples in the war crimes field where I think that sort of situation could occur.
Okay, thank you. Annabelle McConaughey. I had two questions. This morning in the Sydney Morning Herald, you mentioned the Vasilikovic case, and I just wondered if you knew what are the next steps in this one. Are we likely to extradite him anytime soon or at all? And then the other thing as well, whether Australia will request extradition to Australia for war criminals. The Balibo 5, there was an inquest about 18 months ago, and before Rudd got into power, he said that as a result of that inquest and a finding that war crimes had occurred in that case, that he would seek to bring these people to justice. Do you think anything will happen with that one either?
I mean, this is a difficult question because I'm speculating on issues that I haven't looked into in this paper in particular. In the Vasilikovic case, there's still avenues for appeal, and as I understand the media reports, there's his lawyers are still thinking about whether they will go to the next stage of appeal. So there's very little more I think I can say on that. It just really depends on what they decide. The track record with extraditions in Australia is that there has never been an extradition from Australia for war crimes in a war crimes case. So this would be, if he was extradited, it would be the first extradition for war crimes involving war crimes allegations. In terms of the people involved in the Balibo case, I really have no idea what would be the case there. It all depends, I guess, on the evidence and the circumstances and other issues involved.
Donald McLean, any interested citizen. Just recalling the case, what sort of teeth does the ICC have if, in fact, it eventually falls on their lap to decide? I'm just recalling back the days when the Pan American aircraft was blown up and landed in Lockerbie in Scotland. After an extensive investigation, I think they tracked the bombers to hiding in Libya. They had the court case there, and I think they were found guilty, but they were still in Libya. So can the ICC do anything, or do they just reach a verdict and let somebody else try and solve it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the issue with a lot of international organisations that don't have their own police forces to go around and implement their decisions or carry out their orders. But the ICC does states that are members of the ICC, and there's now, as I mentioned, 108 of them, are under an obligation to assist the ICC. And in the early cases at the ICC, the people that were surrendered to the ICC, they were already in custody in various courts in Africa, as it turned out. But there was a recent case where an individual was, and I think the deputy president, I think, of Congo was arrested in Belgium by Belgian police And that was, I think, a very significant development in terms of demonstrating that it was possible for the ICC's indictments to be carried out using, taking advantage of the resources that other states make available to it. And there are a number of states that work very closely with the ICC. Interpol publishes ICC arrest warrants and sealed arrest warrants. So I think there is certainly the possibility that the ICC could be a success, especially when you look at the travel movements of a lot of these people. They tend to be high-profile senior political and military leaders, and they tend to do a lot of travelling, which exposes them to possible arrest in member state countries. So, yeah, I think it does have the potential to have teeth, and we've seen the first examples of that, which were quite surprising, I think.
Alison Brunosky, Fergus. It has been suggested, perhaps fancifully by some people, that former President Bush travels at some risk if he goes maybe to Belgium or places where those deemed to be international criminals can be accused by courts there. If that were the case, and if there were such an allegation brought against President Bush, what do you think the implications of that for Prime Minister Howard would be?
This will be an easy question. When I was in The Hague, actually, the ICC had received a lot of... one of the interesting provisions in the ICC is that individuals or concerned groups can make submissions to the prosecutor on allegations of war crimes offences. And in the course of the Iraq War, a number of NGOs had submitted applications to the ICC to look into allegations. And when I was there, the prosecutor had wrapped up those investigations and found that there was, in fact, no basis for looking into going further and establishing investigations into those claims. So I think there's jurisdictional issues as well. I mean, the United States is not a member of the ICC, so there's no way the prosecutor could initiate investigations into any case involving America unless it's committed in a member state. So I think the prosecutor is also very concerned to make sure that the court is a success and doesn't in any way pick up a reputation as pursuing politically motivated cases. And in all the cases that have come before the ICC so far, they've been at the request of member states, with the exception of Sudan, which I think really demonstrates the fact that states themselves see the benefit of the ICC coming in and acting as an impartial arbiter in war crimes situations. So, I hope that sort of covers the question.
Sam Nightingale. In terms of high-ranking officials travelling to other nations who have signed up to the Rome Treaty, isn't that to some extent still a problem with diplomatic immunity? Because I'm not sure if it was the case in the question over there about the Vice President of the Congo going to Belgium and being arrested, but there was another case, I think, in Belgium, or maybe it was that case, where he was arrested, but then the ICC said Belgium actually had to let him go because he still had diplomatic immunity.
Well, there's been some developments in international law, and I think now it's quite widely accepted that even sitting heads of state are not immune from prosecution for war crimes offences. And there's so I think that there's certainly the case that, as we've seen, for example, with the prosecutor requesting an indictment against the president of Sudan, the current president, those kind of cases can still go ahead, regardless of whether the person is sitting head of state or not.
I fully understand that you are very careful in criticising the government too harshly, but my question is, why is it, or what's your view, that Australia, and I'm not talking about governments, but I'm talking about society, politics, the whole culture, has hardly shown any interest over the last 50 years in war crimes issues?
I'm not sure I entirely agree. I mean, I think the war crimes unit that was set up in the 80s had the person sitting next to you actually who initiated those investigations ran a series on the ABC, and that led to a popular movement in favour of looking into these allegations. I think the trend is in terms of permanent international war crimes units is quite recent. There's a lot of the units that are being set up in Europe are relatively recent. Sweden just set its up last year. So I think there's an emerging trend that recognises that no matter how good your border screening processes are, that suspects will still get through, and you need to have a backup plan, and that plan needs to involve a dedicated war crimes unit. The Labor government, as I mentioned, has come to office promising to review the resources that are given to investigations and also to close the loopholes. So you've got at least a commitment there, I think, from the political leadership as well to do something about this.